That's Rod Serling introducing an episode of The Twilight Zone more than half a century ago. Starting tomorrow, the show is back in an all-new series on CBS All Access.
A man stands in an attic holding a sword he took from a dead soldier 20 years earlier. Across from him stands a young man who has just admitted his own father may have helped plan the attack on Pearl Harbor. Neither one leaves the room. Neither one is telling the whole truth. And for 55 years, American television refused to let anyone watch what happened next. This is the story of The Encounter, the single most suppressed episode in the history of The Twilight Zone, and why a 25-minute drama filmed in 1964 was considered too dangerous to broadcast for more than half a century. The Twilight Zone premiered on CBS in October of 1959, and almost immediately it became something television hadn't seen before. It wasn't a sitcom, it wasn't a procedural, and it didn't ask audiences to follow the same characters week after week. Instead, creator Rod Serling built an anthology, a rotating cast of strangers and settings, each episode a self-contained parable dressed up as science fiction. Serling himself had fought in the Pacific during World War II, and the horrors he witnessed there never fully left him. He came home not wanting to entertain people, but to unsettle them, to make them look honestly at the things they preferred to avoid. Over the course of the series, he wrote or co-wrote the majority of its 156 episodes, and his calm, measured narration became as iconic as the stories themselves. What made Serling's approach so effective was disguise. He understood that a network executive who would never approve a script about racism in the American South might happily approve the same story if it were set on a distant planet. A sponsor who would object to a direct commentary on authoritarian government might not blink if that same commentary came wrapped in a tale about aliens or time travel. Science fiction became Serling's shield, a way of smuggling uncomfortable truths past the people whose job it was to keep television safe and inoffensive. It worked for years. Episodes like Time Enough at Last and The Shelter use speculative premises to explore real Cold War anxieties, nuclear fear, and the fragile nature of civility under pressure. But Serling had already learned, the hard way, that even disguise had limits. In 1956, before The Twilight Zone existed, he wrote a live television drama inspired by the murder of Emmett Till. Network censors gutted it so thoroughly that the finished broadcast bore almost no resemblance to the crime that inspired it, changing the victim's identity entirely to avoid upsetting Southern affiliates. Serling later said the experience taught him exactly how far he could push, and exactly where the industry would push back. That lesson caught up with him again in the spring of 1964, during the final season of The Twilight Zone, with an episode called The Encounter. It aired once, on May 1st, and then it disappeared. The story is a bottle episode, meaning it unfolds in a single location with only two actors carrying the entire runtime. Neville Brand plays Fenton, a bitter World War II veteran going through junk in his attic. George Takei, years before he would become known worldwide through Star Trek, plays Arthur, a young Japanese-American man who arrives looking for work. What begins as an uneasy but ordinary conversation slowly turns into something far more volatile. Fenton finds a samurai sword he took from a Japanese soldier during the war, and as the two men drink and talk, old wounds start to surface. Fenton admits, gradually and with obvious guilt, that the man he killed may not have been an active threat, that the sword might be a trophy taken from something closer to an execution than combat. Arthur, meanwhile, reveals that his real name is Taro, and that his father was accused of spying for Japan, of having a hand in the planning of the attack on Pearl Harbor. By the end, both men are trapped, not just in the attic, but in decades of unresolved trauma, suspicion, and shame, and the episode closes in violence. The backlash was immediate. CBS received a wave of complaints, and Asian American organizations objected strongly to the implication that a Japanese-American man's father had committed treason against the United States. The timing mattered enormously. In 1964, the U.S. government had still not formally acknowledged the injustice of what it had done to Japanese-American citizens during the war. More than 120,000 people, the overwhelming majority of them American citizens, had been forcibly removed from their homes after Pearl Harbor and placed in internment camps, without trial, without evidence, and without any proof of disloyalty. To broadcast a story in which a Japanese-American character seemed to confirm the very suspicion that had justified that mass incarceration struck many viewers as reckless, even cruel, regardless of how the episode actually treated its characters. CBS, already nervous about declining ratings and Serling's increasingly pointed political material, chose the simplest path. They quietly pulled The Encounter from syndication, and it vanished from reruns, from cable packages, from home video releases, and from the collective memory of the show's fans. What the network's decision ignored was the nuance actually built into the writing. Fenton is not portrayed as a hero. He is unstable, consumed by guilt, and possibly dangerous, a man haunted less by the war itself than by what the war revealed about him. Arthur is just as complicated. His confession about his father is never confirmed as fact. It may be something he was told as a child, something he has never been able to verify, or something he uses as a weapon in the moment because he has spent his whole life being treated as suspect anyway. Neither character offers the audience a comfortable place to stand. There is no clean hero and no clean villain, only two men shaped by violence and unable to set it down. That refusal to offer easy moral clarity was exactly the kind of storytelling Serling was known for, but in this instance, it was also exactly what made network executives and advertisers uneasy enough to bury the episode entirely. George Takei's own history made his role in the encounter especially personal, even if most viewers at the time had no idea. He was 5 years old when soldiers came to remove his family from their Los Angeles home, and he spent part of his childhood behind barbed wire at the Rower War Relocation Center in Arkansas, one of 10 camps built to hold Japanese American families during the war. He has spoken since then many times about what it meant to grow up understanding that his own government had labeled him and his family a threat simply because of their ancestry. That experience shaped the rest of his life and eventually turned him into one of the most visible advocates for civil rights and historical memory in American public life. Standing in front of a camera in 1964, playing a character forced to reckon with an accusation eerily close to the one used to justify his own childhood imprisonment, Takei was doing something far more layered than most viewers at the time could have understood. The episode stayed buried for decades. Bootleg copies circulated quietly among devoted fans, and rumors spread about why it had disappeared, some accurate, some exaggerated into myth. It wasn't until 2016 that the Sci-Fi Channel, airing a New Year's Eve Twilight Zone marathon, slipped the encounter back into rotation for the first time since its original broadcast, unedited and without fanfare. The reaction was immediate. Longtime fans who had only heard rumors of the episode were finally able to see it, and newer audiences, unfamiliar with its history, were struck by how raw and uncomfortable it still felt, even after 50 years. Since then, the episode has slowly worked its way back into wider circulation, culminating in its inclusion in complete collections and re-releases reaching audiences in 2025. It's worth remembering that The Encounter wasn't the only Twilight Zone episode kept out of syndication. Miniature, starring a young Robert Duvall, was pulled for years over a copyright dispute with the estate of writer Charles Beaumont. A Short Drink from a Certain Fountain disappeared amid unresolved legal concerns. Sounds and Silences was dropped after a lawsuit alleging the story was based on a real person without consent. An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, an Academy Award-winning French short film that CBS licensed for a single broadcast, aired only once due to the terms of that license. Together, these episodes reveal something larger than any single controversy, a television industry in which stories could be silenced not because they were poorly made, but because they made the people in charge of distribution uncomfortable, legally or politically. The reason The Encounter still resonates today has less to do with nostalgia and more to do with how familiar its central dynamic remains. In the years since the pandemic began, anti-Asian hate crimes rose sharply across the United States, with elderly citizens assaulted, women attacked in public, and American-born residents told to go back to countries some of them had never even visited. Fear and suspicion, once again, found a convenient target. The formal apology for Japanese American internment didn't come until 1988, when President Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act, acknowledging that the internment had been driven by race prejudice and wartime hysteria rather than any real threat. But an apology on paper, decades later, doesn't erase what happened, and it doesn't guarantee the same instincts won't resurface in a different form. That's the quiet power of The Encounter. It never resolves its tension. It leaves Fenton and Arthur, and by extension the audience, sitting with the discomfort of unfinished history rather than offering a tidy ending. Rod Serling understood something that still holds true, that trauma doesn't respect timelines, that guilt and suspicion get passed down like inherited objects, and that burying a difficult story rarely makes the discomfort disappear, it only delays the reckoning. 55 years after CBS decided the world wasn't ready for this story, it turns out the world may finally be ready to sit with it, uncomfortable as that sitting still is.